to a special edition of a session with IBRAD founder, Shri Bhagwan Roy. Hello, how are you, sir?
Hello, namaskar. Yeah, fine, thank you.
Thank you. And Supreme Court Advocate Sanjay Upadhyay. It's such a pleasure to have both of you gentlemen with me. Today, we're going to talk about climate resilient, sustainable tribal development in the backdrop of what transpired at COP26 in Glasgow. Professor Roy, I'd like to put it to you right away. The indigenous people seem to have been sort of left out of the climate solution, the climate crisis solution. There was some protests as well in Glasgow. So really, have we learned nothing from what the indigenous people have been trying to tell us for so many years?
Yes, there has been mixed response at Glasgow. One positive thing was this is the first time the indigenous community participated. I think nearly 26 countries representative participated. And they also had opportunity of sharing their feeling. But what was very important, that the expectation, the way they wanted to negotiate was not heard. And although there was a working group committee in which indigenous community were also allowed to participate, but the whole thing was that they did not get their message heard over there. Let me share two important points. One, that the issue of climate change. The problem of climate change is not for the indigenous community alone. It's all of us suffer.
Right.
And the global discussion was not for the indigenous community alone. So on the whole, we see the people, indigenous, non-indigenous, tribal, non-tribal, different caste, rich, poor, different nation, different religion, all as a human being have a suffering. And we want solution. That's straightforward. We all suffer, we want solution. And in the solution, the major solution which comes from almost all the country is reduce firewood, fuel consumption, reduce consumption of chemical fertilizer, reduce consumption of the forest resources, reduce consumption of all the minerals like coal. So this is a global agenda, and almost everyone wanting that man-made problem because of the deforestation, because of excessive use of the chemical fertilizer, because of the use of the fossil fuel, because of the use of a certain biodiversity has to be checked. That we all agree. But when the question of operation comes, who will do? So that because of a human being, the greed, not the need, the rich people negotiate and try to bring the solution in their favor.
Mr. Upadhyay, may I bring you in here and talk about this unequal relationship that indigenous people have always had all across the globe, not just in India, with the establishment, with the powers that be. What can we do to ensure that it does not remain so?
So let me just take you back with your previous question. I think the point that Professor Roy was mentioning about what is their cumulative say in any debate like this, internationally, when you're negotiating a position. One thing obviously is that their population is, like in India, we have 8.1% of tribal population, out of which, if you really look at the communities who are, forest dependent and are in the remote areas, it's the quantum becomes much lesser. So in any case, the voice that we have is very, very, very little. so to speak. So I think that's a point that has to resonate, and that is why we will see that all their approaches or their practices, when it comes to mainstream policies, they're always a little, they are always left behind because they don't have that voice. And I think
Right.
so in that sense, I'm very happy that you're organizing this kind of a conversation, because these voices are to be heard more. And that is where the
Right.
solution lies to your question, that when we look at the practices, whether it's traditional practices or customary practices of the innumerable tribal communities that we have and their clans and subclans, you'll find that most of these practices are rooted in history, long-term use of traditional resilient practices. Of course, these terms were not in currency then, but if you look at their
Mhm.
approaches and practices, then there's a lot to learn. And I was very fascinated by this uh, program called the Tribal Climate Resilience Program of Alaska, incidentally, where there's it's a complete program on looking at exactly the issues that we're discussing today. But there's a very simple tool there which says there should be tribal climate listening sessions. And I was very fascinated by the fact that, do we have enough platform and mechanisms to listen to them
Right.
and listen to the youth, their adaptation, mitigation mechanisms, their own practices? So I think we need to really develop programs where we listen more and stop dictating what they need to do.
Exactly.
Because there are enough examples, and I'm probably going to speak a little more on that. But this is my opening remarks as far as how do you mainstream their points in the larger climate policy that we enunciate. Is get them to talk, listen to them more, more, understand the distinctions more, and then frame the policies.
Professor Roy, can I bring you in here and talk about how can this happen? We do have acts in India, we have legislation, but
Yeah.
they don't seem to be enough. The powers that be still don't seem to be listening to the indigenous people. What can we do to make them work together?
Mm. Yeah, that's a very important question. We have good acts and
Yeah.
policy. I'm glad Mr. Sanjay Upadhyay is here, and I am sure he will also correct me that we have Biological Diversity Act.
Yeah.
And under the Biological Diversity Act, we are, the Indian, are supposed to conserve, and at the different panchayat level. So at all level of panchayat functionary, conservation has to be there. So there's act is there.
Hmm.
Under the act, there's a very clear instruction I can call to prepare people's biodiversity register. So the operational plan, however good act and intentions are there, the operation plans are very, very difficult to come on the ground unless we have a mechanism of policy with capacity building support. So often we have good policy, but operational plan to come to the ground and build the capacity of the people to implement it. If the building capacity of the people is not done, it is difficult to implement the act and policy. So my first reaction is building capacity of the people who will prepare people's biodiversity register. If that is maintained, I think most part of the biodiversity problem will be taken care of that. So this is the first thing. We have also very good policy and act, Forest Right Act 2006.
Right.
They are also with very good intention that Adivasi or tribal indigenous community, they will be vested right with the land, forest land. for their own use, and the community will be using the forest resources. Not only that, they are empowered by act. I'm saying empowered by act. They are empowered to prepare their own management plan.
Mr. Upadhyay, why is that? Is it in the framing? Is there a fault in the framing of the act? Are the acts too ambitious? Not ambitious enough? Do they not consult the indigenous people when the acts are made? Or when they get feedback, they're unable to amend the acts? Where does really the problem lie?
So I'll answer that in two different ways. One is, of course, whenever any legislation is made, the
Yeah.
first and foremost is what is the constitutional framework? And I think very importantly, whenever we talk about tribal communities, the constitution has been a very strong instrument which exists. And in India, the constitutional framework is pretty robust as far as tribal protection is concerned, their customs are concerned. And even when we look at certain legislations like the Forest Rights Act, which Professor Roy was mentioning, uh, at least in my understanding, since I was part of the drafting committee of the FRA, what I found was there was a lot of consultation. Many groups were consulted. We went across the country. Many workshops were held, not only for the legislation, but also for the rules which operationalize the particular act. So there was this huge change then where a lot of consultation did happen. The trouble is when consultations happen and when opinions are given, how much of that is taken back and legislated and remodified is the query, is the real issue. Because there I see that there's a lot of reluctance when views start pouring in. How do we weave those views of different communities, different viewpoints, different worldviews to really legislate back? So that is a huge issue. Some laws, for example, PESA, the Provisions of Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act, 1996. If you look at that law, it's a very small piece of legislation, but I call it very aspirational law. And whenever you make a very aspirational law, the flip side is it doesn't become operational. So when you make a very lofty sort of a legislation like PESA, which really talks about self-determination and Gram Sabha being the the whole harbinger of Gram Swaraj, etc. So there are very good words there, but when it comes to the operational part, it's missing. Because most state governments who were given the liberty to look at that framework and enact and adapt their respective legislation, that has not happened. Similarly, if you go to the northeastern states, you'll find that we have two kinds of states, the sixth scheduled states and the special states. And in both these cases, you will find that the constitution itself provides, but these are a vintage of 1950s. So we have not really looked into the modern concerns. It's more about, whether the hunter and gatherer will be allowed to do their things or not, whether customary practices of dispute resolution should happen or not. But they have not evolved over a period of time. And if you look at the scheduled states, for example, Assam, Tripura, Meghalaya, Mizoram, you'll find that the legislations themselves have not evolved over a period of time. Similarly, while you've created special states like Nagaland or Arunachal or Sikkim or Manipur, you'll find that after creation of those special states, we have not legislated enough to accommodate the modern practices or their own traditional practices. So it's a lot of lip service, and it is dehors a lot of details that is required for the present operation, the present concern, especially when we talk about climate issues.
So, Professor Roy, what can we do to overcome this? I mean, we do need lofty laws as well. I mean, if we don't aspire to something, we'll never get there, as Mr. Upadhyay said. There is, of course, when he talked about FRA, there were a lot of consultations, but necessarily not all were taken into consideration. There's obviously a colonial sort of mindset, a hangover. But, surely 75 years on, we can now at least start acknowledging that that the indigenous people are part of us. They have their heritage is something that we can learn from. Why
Yes.
has that integration not happened on a wider scale?
If you allow me, I will share with example case study in response to your question, what can be done? Policy is there.
Yeah.
And as Sanjay ji mentioned, operational plan, and sometimes it is too ambitious to operationalize what he has mentioned. So if we make it realistic, situation specific, based on the tradition as well as modernity, both. He used very good word that it's not that they all are very primitive and there's a evolution. So I will share, if you allow me, just 5 minutes about the operational plan realistic. We have worked in number of states. How the act will be operationalized. So I will request from your people, Magesh, if he can show me a picture, number one, where I have been showing how the tribal with their own culture, when they were trained for organic farming, they picked up quickly. How they picked up? Because of the act was there, operational plan was made to their culture. Look at this innovation. Sanjay ji, dekhiye, you must have not seen this kind of thing, that in the tribal area, when there is a water underneath and they evolve, make a macha for nursery. And this is the case of forest fringe area with the operational plan of the biodiversity and also blend with FRA. These acts are complementary to each other, but we look into isolation. So one of our problems that we look any issue in isolation, we have to see the total frame of all the acts. They are not contradictory, they are complementary. So finding one issue of complementary of how the biodiversity conservation and forestry, FRA, will be merged, and it has become one of the important issue of climate resilience, because the climate resilient want that conservation of water, moderating temperature, and also conservation of soil and nutrition. So all 5 components are taken care here for climate resilient livelihood, keeping in mind the Act, Biological Diversity Act, Forest Right Act, and what I mentioned about the meeting with the social and culture. So this is one of the examples that we have to come to the micro level. Act will remain, operational plan has to be designed, and it has to be compatible to the local culture so that adopt it.
So how can now these are at the micro level? How can these things be popularized at the mass level? As you have often told us, Professor Roy, every indigenous community is not alike. There are differences between indigenous communities as well. So how can these be taken and created into a mass movement that the mainstream can also adopt? And why not? It has to be done.
Yeah. In order to make it from micro to macro, again, there has to be a different operational plan where the bureaucratic organization who operate with their framework of the rules and regulation, they will act, because the bureaucracy is meant for following the rules and regulation, and it is a structured hierarchy. So there has to be reorientation of the bureaucratic process, reorientation of the forest field staff how to learn the local culture and make the management plan depending upon the culture of the people, their livelihood need, environmental rule framework, and economic development. So all four will be taken care at the management plan. But this management plan has to be prepared by the bureaucratic field staff who are working. Because this, as you have rightly said, very good question. It may be done at micro level with some committed organization. There are many very good organizations. They are working. Excellent work they have done. But it is not universal. So for universalization, we have to transform the bureaucratic process, their ethos, values, and operational plan. And that is why I mentioned from the beginning, bilateral matching institution. That means community institution has to be understood. And the bureaucratic institution should be complementary to each other. It should not be supplementary. It has to be made complementary institution, bilateral matching institution.
Mr. Upadhyay, how do we do that? Do we need yet another law? I hope not.
No, not really. I mean, I am always of the view that whenever we make a legislation which is what we call in our parlance umbrella legislations, you always have legal spaces within which you have to use your innovations. So, when you look at different systems, for example, when we were growing up in this discipline and understanding issues, we got to know about how the Apatanis in Arunachal, how they do their rice cultivation differently. People consider jhum cultivation, for example, as bad practice. But if you look at the manner of sowing in a jhum scenario, which is not contour based, but it is vertical, so it takes care of high rainfall areas in the northeastern states. If you look at the Lindo forest in Meghalaya, for example, if you understand the Chua system in Jharkhand, for example, if you look at the Devbani system in Rajasthan, for example, if you look at the Kankarbani system there, if you look at Sendra, which is the Akhand Shikar, which is supposed to remove diseased animals from the forest, if you look at the way the people of Odisha look at the turtles as the Kurma avatar, if you look at the Nahar Devta in Rajasthan, if you look at the manner in which in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, the Baigas do their Bewar cultivation or the Penda cultivation of the Madhya tribes in Gachibowli in Maharashtra, you will find that we have a lot of rich practices which are out there, across the board. The trouble is, are we listening enough? Are we accommodating these practices within the framework? Now, if you look at shifting cultivation, today it is considered to be a violation of the Indian Forest Act. But we have to take the good points of what and how it can be done. And all these systems that I just mentioned, these are just a tip of the iceberg as far as Indian culture and practices are concerned. How do we weave all this into our current frame? I think it's possible. All that is required, I take the point that Professor Roy was mentioning. Is there a will to do that or not? If the will is there, then these systems can be integrated into your modern management plans. If you're looking at your conservation and management plan, for example, under the Forest Rights Act, if you're looking at your tribal sub plans, if you're looking at any of your planning tools for that matter, management plans of national parks and sanctuaries, working plans of forest areas, coastal zone management plans of coastal areas, it's always possible to integrate these systems in your planning tool itself and then make it mandatory. And I think this is where we lack because we don't listen enough, we don't understand enough, and we don't value them enough for it to be a strong tool. Actually, these systems are very strong tool for conservation, for sustainability, for resilience. So unless we take this and make it into our mainstream as regular practices, we will not really succeed. And that's the message I wanted to give.
Absolutely. And, I mean, when you spoke of all these diverse practices, these are lessons for the whole world, not just for India. I mean, we can make the case for the whole world, the kind of diversity that we have in indigenous peoples in India. So, Professor Roy, in our concluding remarks, really the question is, why can we not set an example, for the world? Just as we've exported yoga, Ayurveda, why can we not export these indigenous practices? First, of course, assimilate them ourselves, but export these to the world and create a whole new framework for the world as well, which is really struggling for a solution.
That's again an important question. To your first question, how to operationalize to the macro level, and then when it comes to micro level, how it can be at macro level. So I mentioned about the transformation of the bureaucratic process, make change, and the site-specific, culture-specific management plan.
Right.
For this management plan operation, there are number of principles. What happens? Because we are human, we have some biasness for advocating one of my strong points. I again say, we as a human will like to advocate on my point of view. But nature works in harmony of different point of view. What Sanjay ji mentioned, different culture. So we're discussing on the climate resilient. So on the climate resilient sustainable development, there are certain nature's principle of harmony we call Saptapadi, just to remember. And all the 7 steps of social, ecological, and economic has to come under one frame. It is a problem with the academic also. The anthropologists will advocate on anthropological principle. The botanist will talk his own drum somewhere else. Economists will talk of economic theory. And it is never harmony. So Saptapadi is one approach what IBRAD has planned, that in order to implement the first thing, awareness, and awareness is not informing people. Awareness means asking people, knowing from them what could be the possible solution for degradation of the forest.
Right.
So I will again quote Sanjay ji, listening to them.
Yeah.
But we academics don't have a patience to listen. We jump on advising. So the first thing, listening to them, and I will show you few slides how after listening to them on 7 steps, the climate resilient development was planned and is implemented, and not at one place. Number of villages IBRAD has been implementing. So the first is on awareness, second on knowing them what can be done, and they will say what can be done. And then third, can you do it alone? They will say no. Then how to do that? So they will, hum log milke karenge, unitedly. So the third step is how to frame a group and ask them, आप लोगों में से कोई नहीं follow करेगा तो क्या करेंगे? So they will have a social framework of their own. Like when you enter temple, remove shoes. When you have a marriage, अग्नि के 7 फेरे, 4 फेरे कोई बैठेगा? No, 5, 6, 7. So the society will count the rule. Society will become inspector. And society will frame control mechanism. So that is the third one. The fourth one, once awareness is there, group is formed, and they agree, then you have to start conducting any capacity building, training or skill development. Normally what happens, we jump on the training. हाँ training कराना है, कितने लोगों को 100, 500, oh he has 1,000. We should not start training on the first stage. In the fourth stage, when people have their own rules and regulation and agree to implement, then they will listen and adopt new technology. And the fifth point is allow people to think on the trade-off analysis. What price you have to pay to regain your heaven. And they will decide. They will spend time, will spend money. Unless people agree to spend time, unless they agree to spend their own money, that's very important. If people do not agree to spend time, if people do not agree to spend their own money, it is not people's program. It is government program, because government is giving, government law, government fund. So how to come to that paying price, the trade-off will be done by the people. And then you give any resource. Yeah.
Right. Mr. Upadhyay, can we see a future where we have a COP27 or whatever it's going to be called, where we have a display of diversity, where instead of political leaders, we have leaders from indigenous communities coming forward and saying, look, this is what you can learn from us. I know it sounds idealistic, but surely we can do something of that nature.
So, if you look at the first, let me respond to the earlier question that you had just hinted. How can we export this to the larger global agenda? I think in the corporate world, it is very popular that unless you bring the issue or the agenda in the boardroom, things don't get implemented. So I think the boardroom of the country is obviously the PMO. And unless you get the agenda at the PMO level or the Niti Aayog level, where it is demonstrated with evidence that this is something that needs to be told to the world. So I think we have to bring it to the mainstream politics, if I can use the word. And unless we bring it to the mainstream politics, the relevance of these practices and how we can export this, that these are hundreds of yoga, yoga equivalents to the world.
Exactly.
And I think
Yeah.
we need to do that. So it has to come to that agenda of the powers to be. And I think it's possible because we need to have the correct communication strategy. We need to communicate these in different forums like this, the way you're doing it. And I think it is going to once we get these out there to the people who matter and the powers to be, and then it becomes an agenda for climate governance talks around the world, then I think we will communicate that very well. I think that is very important, and therefore, the Niti Ayogs become very important. The PMO becomes very important, and the people there become very important when you get this agenda. The second question that you mentioned, whether we have forums like this. Yes, of course we have forums like this. If you look at, I forget the exact name. There is a UN forum for indigenous people. And I remember Ramdayal Mundaji from Jharkhand, a very well-known tribal activist. Unfortunately, he's no more. He was a Rajya Sabha member as well. He used to be the India representative for the UN Indigenous Forum for the world. And I think there are forums available where we can voice these things. The important bit, however, is the interconnectedness of that voice to the larger decision-making parties. And I think we have to that divide is rather huge. So the
Yeah.
voices are there. There are people who will go with
The
flags and
independence
yeah.
goes,
So there are silos, within which they talk and they sometimes preach to the convert. But what
Yeah.
is important is to get that message to the powers to be globally. And I think India can play a very important role because the
That's
kind
right.
of
Yeah.
reputation we have today around the world, that if we say, there are people who are going to listen.
Listen.
And I think this is perhaps the right time to take all these agendas to the global platform and ensure that these are real practices, evidence through the ages. We've had historical, proof of these things working. I mean, just to give one example, when I was mentioning about the PENDA system, etc., what I understood was that when the rice cultivation fails due to erratic rainfall, it's the millets which actually feed the stomachs.
Right.
And the system there on small land holdings of creating those kutkis and the millets is what actually feeds and then allows them to survive through a climate variation. So there are so many such examples, I can go on and on, which we need to document, mainstream, and then tell the world that, look here, we may not be calling it climate resilience technology in agriculture practice in the currency that you understand, but we've been doing it for years. And for God's sake, learn it now and now and not later when it is too late.
Yeah. So, Professor Roy, in conclusion, may I suggest to you that we, with your assistance, we hold one such conclave and one such summit, Mr. Upadhyay, where we actually can showcase some of this diversity. And what a wonderful showcase and display of the indigenous tribal practices it will be, and how much we can learn from it. So I hope at some point we can do something of that nature. It is ambitious, but if we don't aim high, we'll never get anywhere.
Absolutely.
So thank you both gentlemen very much.
I think, Kaveri,
Yeah.
my concluding remark,
Yes, please.
which will be my quote, that all the action which has caused climate change, global warming, for that, indigenous tribal are not responsible.
That's
The
right.
cause are the people who have got more have. And the beauty of this program, that those who have not caused climate change, we are seeking solution from them,
That's
climate
right.
resilient. And if there is a climate resilient, that means forest conservation, less of use of chemical fertilizer, water conservation, biodiversity conservation, conservation of indigenous seed. All these 7 points I mentioned are the solution of climate resilient livelihood. And this answer is done by the indigenous people because they have the resource forest, and they will be giving benefit to us who have caused problem.
Right.
So look at the whole thing. So there has to be some overarching, I will say overarching sense of responsibility among us, that we are not having a dole to the tribal. We are seeking assistance from them for the global survival. It is not their survival. It is for our survival. Yeah. So climate resilient indigenous people is for our survival, and we are not having a dole. उनके ऊपर उपकार नहीं कर रहे हैं. They will be doing for us. Yeah.
Exactly. Wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, Professor Roy. Thank you, Mr. Upadhyay, for taking time out and for telling us about this wonderful diversity. I hope we can learn something from it, and I hope we can take it to the world. First, take it across India and then to the world.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you for the
taking
opportunity.
the important issue and conveying the message. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you, Sanjay ji. Bye.
Thank you, sir.